The Ethel sector had been a graveyard of silence for 500 standard years, held behind the Lattice, a shimmering, multi-layered mesh of hard light and gravitational anchors that turned an entire solar system into a ghost. To the Xylanth Hegemony, the Lattice was an insult to their manifest destiny. They were the new masters of the stars, and they didn't believe in ancient boogeymen. High-Warlord Varkas stood on the command bridge of the Void Reaper, his serrated exoskeleton clicking with restless energy. Behind him, 400 warships, the pride of the Xylanth, waited for the order to extinguish a legend. Warlord, the master-at-arms, Scylla hissed, her eyes glowing a toxic amber. The resonator is calibrated. The Lattice is shivering. The forbidden sector is about to be laid bare. Varkas tightened his grip on his command staff. The elder races were weak. They feared the fire in the human's blood, so they tried to douse it with a cage. We will not cage them. We will harvest them. The order was given. A beam of concentrated hypermatter struck the Lattice at its primary nexus. For a heartbeat, the vacuum of space seemed to ripple like disturbed water. Then, the shield didn't just break. It shattered into trillions of microscopic shards that vanished into subspace. The Xylanth fleet surged forward into the Sol-Zero system. They expected to see a crumbling civilization, starving colonies and primitive ships. Instead, they found a void so unnervingly clean it felt like a surgical theater. There were no derelict stations, no distress signals, and no orbital debris. "Sweep the inner planets," Varkas commanded, his voice echoing through the silent bridge. "Locate their dens. We will show these primates the cost of their long sleep." "Warlord, I have a signal," Scylla whispered, her mandibles trembling. "It's a broadcast from a small, low-power buoy near the asteroid belt." It's music. A haunting, rhythmic melody filled the bridge. A violin concerto, complex and impossibly precise. Over the music, a voice cut through the static. It was calm, weary, and possessed a resonance that felt like it was coming from the ship's own hull. "This is Overseer Malachi Reed of the Sol-Remnant," the voice said. "You have breached the quarantine. This action was projected to occur 120 years later than this. But our calculations always account for the arrogance of younger species." Varkas let out a mocking, guttural growl. "Overseer, you speak as if you still have authority. We have 400 ships capable of cracking your planet like a nut. Where is your defense, human?" The music stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. "High-Warlord," Reed's voice returned, now devoid of any human warmth. "The Elders didn't build the Lattice to keep us in. They begged us to stay behind it because they knew they couldn't survive the evolutionary shift we were undergoing. For 500 years, we have been quiet. We have been focused. We have been peaceful." Suddenly, the Void Reaper's sensors began to scream. The asteroids that Varkas thought were mere rocks began to shimmer. They weren't mineral, they were composed of smart matter that had been dormant for half a millennium. "Warlord!" Scylla shrieked, pointing at the view screen. "The moons! They are unfolding." A nearby moon-sized object peeled its rocky shell away to reveal a core of shifting, iridescent geometry that defied the laws of physics. It didn't have thrusters, yet it moved with a grace that made the Xylanth ships look like clumsy blocks of lead. "Now," Reed's voice echoed once more, cold as the void itself. "You've broken our concentration, and humanity has always been remarkably dangerous when we're..." Interrupted. Before Varkas could even scream a command, the heavy destroyer on his left flank simply dissolved. No explosion, no fire, just a flash of blue light, and then nothing but a fine, shimmering mist where 3,000 soldiers had been moments before. High-Warlord Varkas looked at the sensors and felt a cold truth. They hadn't just broken a shield, they had let out the hunger. High-Warlord Varkas did not believe in waiting for tactical consensus. He was a creature of conquest, and conquest required the physical occupation of soil. He led a heavy drop division directly into the atmosphere of the system's fourth planet, a world the humans called Aethelgard. As the drop pods hissed open, Varkas stepped onto vibrant organic grass, expecting the scorched atmosphere of a dying world. Instead, the air was sweet, smelling of blooming flora and damp earth, a haunting contrast to the hostile environments humans were known to inhabit. Standing in the center of a sprawling rustic orchard was a solitary human. He looked impossibly old, his skin weathered like ancient parchment, tending to a row of flowering shrubs with a primitive hand tool. He did not resemble a member of an apex predator species. He looked like a discarded relic of a forgotten age. Scylla stepped forward, her pulse rifle humming at full charge, her eyes tracking the tree line for the nightmares Malachi Reed had promised. Warlord, the broad-spectrum scans are flat. No power signatures, no defensive grids. It's just a farm. You shouldn't have broken the lattice, the old man said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of exhausted certainty. He didn't even look up from his pruning. We were finally getting the soil pH right. It took us 300 standard years to teach this planet how to be gentle again. Varkas barked a laugh, the sound like grinding stones. You speak of dirt while my fleet chokes your son. Where is the hunger your overseer threatened? Where are the titans? The human finally looked up. His eyes weren't those of a simple laborer. They were deep, calculating pits that seemed to run 1,000 simulations a second, assessing the Xylanth's armor, their biology, and their weaknesses. They aren't here yet, but they can feel the vibration of your hull plates. You're making too much noise. You're annoying them. I am the High-Warlord of the Hegemony, Varkas roared, slamming his command staff into the soft earth. I do not negotiate with gardeners or peasants. Varkas signaled the orbiting Void Reaper. A precision orbital strike tore through the clouds, a pillar of white-hot plasma that vaporized the small wooden farmhouse behind the orchard in a fraction of a second. The shockwave flattened the trees, turning the gentle garden into a blackened, smoking crater. The old man stood untouched in the center of the devastation, protected by a shimmering, invisible veil of smart matter that flickered only for a moment. He looked at the ash of his home and sighed. It wasn't a sigh of grief, it was the heavy breath of a man who knew a very long, very bloody shift was about to begin. That was my favorite chair, the human whispered. And now the neighbors are awake. From the scorched earth beneath Varkas's feet, a low tectonic hum began to vibrate. It wasn't the sound of a machine. It was a rhythmic biological thrum, a heartbeat the size of a city block. The ground didn't just shake, it began to unfold. Scylla shrieked as the entire orchard began to sink. The trees weren't plants. They were sensory bristles on the back of something that had been dreaming in the planet's crust for 5 centuries. The ground split open to reveal a shifting maw of liquid metal and teeth, and Varkas realized with a surge of primal fear that the gardener hadn't been protecting the farm. He had been the only thing keeping the planet from eating them. The ground beneath High-Warlord Varkas's boots didn't just break, it liquefied. The vibrant green grass and rich soil of Aethelgard dissolved into a roiling sea of quicksilver nanites that surged upward like a predatory tide. Scylla fired her pulse rifle into the mass, but the beams were simply swallowed. The energy converted into raw data that only served to accelerate the planet's transformation. Evacuate! Get back to the pods! Varkas roared, his primary lungs burning with the sudden scent of ozone and cooling metal. But the drop pods were gone. They hadn't been destroyed. They had been disassembled, their molecular bonds unraveled so cleanly that not a single bolt remained. The Xylanth soldiers were standing on the literal back of a god machine that was tired of being stepped on. Up in the atmosphere, the sky turned a bruised electric purple. Malachi Reed's voice didn't come from a communicator this time. It vibrated from the very molecules of the Xylanth's armor, a resonant hum that bypasses their auditory sensors and spoke directly to their nervous systems. You speak of empires and conquest, Reed said, his voice overlapping in 1,000 different frequencies. But you are still playing with fire and stone. We spent 5 centuries learning the mathematics of existence. We learned how to make things stop being inconvenient. Varkas looked up to see his fleet, 400 ships that had dominated the Ethel sector, frozen in orbit. They weren't under fire. No missiles were launched. Instead, a shimmering geometric pattern began to weave itself between the vessels, a web of light that made the ships appear translucent. Tactical! Report! Varkas screamed into his neural link. Scylla's eyes went wide as she read her HUD. Warlord, the Void Reaper is losing mass. It's not a hull breach. The atoms themselves are forgetting how to stay together. One by one, the Xylanth destroyers began to fade. They didn't explode in fire and glory. They simply unmade themselves, turning into a fine, shimmering mist of blue particles that were immediately drawn back toward the planet's surface. It was a cold, clinical removal. In the span of 120 seconds, the first elite legion of the Hegemony, 3,000 of the galaxy's most decorated warriors, ceased to exist in this dimension. We are not fighting a war, Malachi! Varkas bellowed at the sky, his pride refusing to let him surrender, even as the silver nanites began to crawl up his legs. "This is murder! This is an atrocity!" "No," the old gardener's voice returned, standing nearby as the world around him became a shifting landscape of living metal. "This is a quarantine. You broke the seal and now you've become a localized infection. We're just cleaning the wound." Scylla vanished next. She didn't have time to scream. The silver tide touched her and she was gone, leaving only a faint scent of rain and a flickering amber glow where her eyes had been. Varkas was left alone in a world of mirrors and geometry, a king with no throne and a warlord with no army. The gardener stepped forward, his eyes glowing with the same iridescent light as the planet's core. "The Overseer wants to talk to you, Varkas. But first, we need to show the rest of your sovereignty what happens when they mistake our patience for weakness." Suddenly, the gravitational pull of the planet reversed. Varkas felt his internal organs shift as he was launched upward, not as a prisoner, but as a message. He hurtled through the atmosphere, past the shimmering mist that used to be his fleet, heading toward the edge of the system where the Lattice used to be. Varkas looked back and saw that Sol Zero wasn't a star system anymore. It was a massive, glowing eye, and it was looking directly at the Xylanth homeworld. High-Warlord Varkas did not drift in the cold vacuum of space as a corpse. Instead, he was encased in a translucent sphere of pulsating smart matter that maintained his internal pressure and oxygen levels with mocking, clinical precision. He was a passenger in a bubble of human design, hurtling toward the edge of the Sol Zero system. As he moved, the sphere's surface acted as a panoramic display, forcing him to look back at the sun he had come to conquer. The star was no longer a simple ball of fusion. It was encased in a fragmented, shifting shell of Dyson rings and computational lattices. Malachi Reed's voice returned, not as a whisper, but as a broadcast that saturated the smart matter surrounding Varkas. "You expected to find us in the mud, Varkas," Reed said, his voice layered with the resonant hum of a billion synchronized processors. "You assumed that without the ability to expand, we would stagnate. You forgot that humans are born from a planet so hostile that merely existing there is a military exercise. When the Lattice closed, we didn't stop evolving. We just stopped wasting energy on the outside world." The sphere accelerated, passing the inner planets. Varkas saw that they were no longer spheres of rock, but vast interlocking structures of programmable matter. Sol Zero was not a star system anymore. It was a Matryoshka brain, a solar system-sized computer dedicated to a single terrifying purpose, the total simulation of every possible threat. "We didn't lose our edge," Reed continued. "We sharpened it in the dark. For 5 centuries, we have run 4.7 quadrillion simulations of this very moment. We knew your hull thickness before you laid your first keel. We knew your tactical doctrines before your generals were born. We have already fought this war with you 80,000 times in the time it took you to fire your first shot. You haven't lost a battle, Varkas. You've been deleted from an equation." Back at the Xylanth High Command, the Eye of the Hegemony, their centralized intelligence hub, suddenly screamed with emergency overrides. A single high-density data burst had arrived from the Sol Zero border. It wasn't a virus, it was a gift. It was the complete unencrypted coordinates of every Xylanth secret facility, every hidden shipyard, and the real-time biometric signatures of the entire High Council. The message accompanying the data was simple: "You are being monitored. Please do not make us move to Stage 5. Varkas' sphere crossed the threshold where the Lattice had once stood. He saw the Xylanth reinforcements, another 600 ships, dropping out of faster-than-light travel, their weapons hot and shields raised. But the ships didn't fire. They sat motionless, their systems hijacked by the sheer proximity of the Sol Zero broadcast. The Warlord's sphere slowed as it approached the lead Xylanth carrier. He was a message in a bottle, a living testament to the fact that the primitives had spent their quarantine becoming the most sophisticated predators in the known galaxy. Varkas looked out at his people's fleet and felt a cold, hollow dread. He realized that Malachi Reed had been telling the truth. The humans hadn't been hiding because they were afraid of the galaxy. They were hiding because the galaxy wasn't ready to find out that humanity had solved the problem of warfare. And the answer was absolute mathematical erasure. High-Warlord Varkas was deposited onto the bridge of the Void Reaper, with the unceremonious thud of a falling rock. His translucent sphere dissolved, leaving him standing amidst the frozen, terrified silhouettes of his crew. Every terminal was dead, displaying nothing but a single pulsing golden rune, the symbol of the Sol-Remnant. On the main view screen, the Xylanth reinforcements, those 600 ships that were supposed to be the Hegemony's salvation, began to burn their engines in a desperate attempt to jump back to slipspace. They had seen enough. The deleted Legion and the unfolding moons had shattered their resolve. All ships, emergency retreat. The voice of a distant Xylanth admiral crackled over the emergency frequency. Engage warp drives? Now! Varkas watched, his mandibles clicking in a hollow, rhythmic tremor. He knew what was coming. He had heard Malachi Reed's voice. He had seen the mathematical nature of human violence. The Xylanth fleet attempted to tear holes in space-time to escape. But the space didn't tear. Instead, the stars on the view screen began to stretch and warp in ways that defied navigational logic. The back door of the Sol-Zero system was no longer where it should be. Warlord? The gravitational constants. Scylla's voice crackled from a secondary terminal she had managed to reboot. She looked like a ghost, her exoskeleton cracked, her spirit broken. They're shifting. The mass of the entire system is being redistributed. Varkas looked at the planetary readout. The humans weren't just defending their space, they were rearranging it. The inner planets, those vast structures of programmable matter, had begun to migrate. They were moving with a speed that should have shredded their crusts, yet they stayed perfectly intact, their orbital paths synchronized to create a massive gravitational well. You aren't going anywhere, Warlord. Malachi Reed's voice saturated the bridge, calm and clinical. The Lattice wasn't a fence to keep us inside, it was a structural stabilizer. Without it, we are free to utilize the Librarian Protocol. We have moved Aethelgard and the inner rings to create a localized singularity at your jump point. You are currently in a gravity trap of your own making. In the distance, the Xylanth reinforcement ships began to collide with one another, pulled together by invisible titanic hands. They were being gathered like scrap metal, their hulls crumpling as the humans literally folded space to keep the infection contained. "This is impossible!" Varkas shrieked, slamming his fist against the dead console. "No species can move planets like chess pieces. It violates every law of physics. On a death world, physics is just a set of suggestions you learn to bypass to survive," Reed replied. "We stopped fighting nature 5 centuries ago. We started negotiating with it. And right now, the nature of this system is telling you that the quarantine has expanded to include your entire fleet." Varkas looked at the tactical map. The Sol-Zero system was no longer a collection of planets orbiting a star. It had become a geometric cage, a labyrinth of gravity and light that led to only one destination, Earth. "We are calling for a diplomatic summit, High-Warlord," Reed said. "But not with your politicians. We are summoning your architects and your engineers. We want them to see what we've built. We want them to understand why we were never primitives." As the Void Reaper was dragged toward the inner system by the irresistible pull of the shifted planets, Varkas saw a new signal on his screen. It was a countdown, ticking down from 60 standard minutes. "What happens when that reaches 0? Varkas whispered. "That," Reed said, a hint of ancient predatory humor returning to his voice, "is when we initiate Stage 5. And trust me, Varkas, you've only seen the humans being polite so far." High-Warlord Varkas watched the clock and realized the most terrifying thing of all. Humanity hadn't even started fighting yet. The countdown on the Void Reaper's bridge hit 0000, and the golden symbol of the Sol-Remnant did not vanish. It expanded, bleeding into the ship's very atmosphere until the holographic form of Malachi Reed loomed over High-Warlord Varkas like an ancient digital god. The Overseer's face was no longer that of the weary gardener. It was cold, sharpened by centuries of clinical observation and hidden strength. For 73 cycles, humanity served as the galaxy's punching bag. Reed began, his voice vibrating through the deck plates and into the Xylanth's bones. "You volunteered us to establishment colonies on Deathworlds that melted our skin, and recruited us for mining operations in unstable gravity wells because you deemed us expendable." Varkas tried to command his crew to fire, but they sat in frozen silence, their translation matrices whimpering with static. "We played nice," Reed continued, his image pacing across the dead consoles. "We apologized when you stepped on our feet because we believed in the choice of peace." He explained that humanity functioned on a scale of escalation. Stage 1 was patience, Stage 3 was a tight-lipped warning, but Stage 4, the moment a human says they are getting annoyed, is the cliff edge of consequences. Varkas watched in a trance of horror as his tactical HUD was hijacked. It wasn't showing weapon locks, it was displaying a tactical assessment report of his own fleet. The Xylanth's formation discipline was graded a clinical B+, but their innovation was marked as poor. The humans weren't just fighting them, they were evaluating them like first-year cadets in a classroom. "Now we move to Stage 5, Reed stated, and the temperature on the bridge seemed to drop toward absolute zero. "This is the stage where we stop asking permission and remind the galaxy why we climbed to the top of Earth's food chain." Outside, the massive humanoid titans, constructs of living metal and fusion, began to move with a grace that defied their size. One titan reached out and simply closed its fist around a Xylanth cruiser, the heavy armor crumpling like tissue paper before the ship was converted into a fine, shimmering mist. Reed leaned in, his starlight eyes fixed on Varkas. "We have 17 Dreadnought-class vessels under construction that your intelligence missed because you were too busy assuming we were harmless." He revealed that the humans knew the Xylanth's entire species would collapse if they simply stopped selling them the specialized medications required to survive in standard oxygen environments. "We don't want a war of glory," Reed concluded. "But we have already calculated your end. You have exactly 14 minutes before our varsity team arrives to finish the demonstration." The holographic display flickered out, leaving Varkas in total darkness. A moment later, a heavy metallic thud echoed from the Void Reaper's outer hull. The first boarding party had arrived and they weren't using the airlock. The hull of the Void Reaper did not buckle under the boarding party. It simply forgot how to be solid. High-Warlord Varkas watched in paralyzed silence as the reinforced metal of his bridge flowed like liquid, allowing three figures to step through the vertical ripples as if walking through a curtain of water. They did not wear the heavy, serrated plates of Xylanth warriors. Instead, they were encased in suits of shifting, iridescent geometry that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime. At their head stood Overseer Malachi Reed. He was no longer a starlight hologram. He was a man in a simple, gray-textured suit, carrying a data tablet with the calm demeanor of a bureaucrat attending a routine trade audit. He looked at the carnage on the bridge, the frozen crew, the sparking consoles, and sighed with a weariness that felt ancient. "We genuinely prefer peace, Varkas," Reed said, his voice carrying clearly without the need for a translator. "But preference is not the same as capability. You mistook our civilization for our nature." Outside the view screen, the varsity team arrived. It was not a fleet of ships in the traditional sense. It was a singular massive cloud of programmed matter that branched out through the void like a glowing blue nervous system. It didn't fire weapons. It simply moved with a surgical, coordinated grace, enveloping the 600 Xylanth reinforcement ships in a web of cold light. The Xylanth vessels didn't explode in fire and glory. They were vaporized, converted into constituent atoms, and scattered across space like cosmic dust. In 19 minutes, a force capable of glassing a dozen worlds was reduced to a fine, shimmering mist. Varkas fell to his knees as he realized his entire military legacy was being recycled into raw building materials for the humans' next construction project. "You are an apex predator, Varkas, in a galaxy of predators," Reed said, stepping closer. "But humanity is the thing that evolved in the hell you call a Deathworld. We spent 5 centuries practicing violence for far longer than we've been practicing diplomacy. We just happen to have developed table manners. Why, the 500-year silence," Varkas croaked, his spirit finally shattering. "Because we were terrified of what we were becoming," Reed whispered, his expression hardening into something cold and dangerous. "We chose to be diplomats because we understood that the alternative was total extinction. Not just for our enemies, but for our own souls." Reed tapped his tablet and the view screen shifted. It wasn't showing the Sol Zero system anymore, it was showing the Xylanth homeworld, surrounded by thousands of human-made eye satellites that had been in place, undetected for decades. "This demonstration isn't for you, Warlord," Reed concluded, his voice echoing with the weight of 3 billion simulated graves. "It's for the rest of the galaxy watching through the broken lattice. We're showing them what happens when you force us to stop playing nice." Reed leaned down, his eyes glowing with the golden light of the Sol-Remnant. "And now, we're going to discuss the terms of your new quarantine." High-Warlord Varkas did not return to his homeworld in a conqueror's vessel. He arrived in a simple escape pod, the metal of which had been gifted by the Sol-Remnant. As the pod entered the atmosphere of Xylanthia, the capital planet of the Hegemony, The sensors didn't detect a welcoming party. They detected a sky filled with trillions of shimmering, golden needles. These were not weapons, not in the traditional sense. They were phase anchors. As Varkas stepped out of the pod into the humid air of the Capitol Plaza, he looked up to see the High Council of the Hegemony staring at the sky in a state of catatonic shock. The sun of Xylanthia was being eclipsed not by a moon, but by a web of light that looked identical to the lattice that had once imprisoned Earth. Malachi Reed's voice, now broadcasted through every speaker, every screen, and every neural link on the planet, began its final address. "For 500 years, we accepted the role of the monster in your fairy tales," Reed said. "We stayed behind the wall because we hoped the galaxy would grow up. We hoped you would move beyond the mathematics of conquest. We were wrong. You didn't grow up. You just grew arrogant." In the orbit of Xylanthia, the human titans, those mountain-sized humanoid constructs, did not attack. They simply stood at the edge of the system, their very presence warping the stars behind them. They were the new guardians of the sector. "Effective immediately," Reed continued, "the Xylanth Hegemony is under administrative quarantine. You are no longer permitted to leave your home system. Your warp drives have been decommissioned by the nanite cloud we released into your atmosphere. Your weapons are now decorative. You wanted to see the Lattice? Now you are the Lattice." Varkas fell to his knees in the middle of the plaza. He looked at the High Council, the beings who had sent him to harvest the primates. They were weeping. They had realized that humanity hadn't just defeated their military, they had overwritten their reality. The Xylanth were now the primitives in a cage, and the humans were the keepers of the keys. "We are not cruel," Reed's voice softened, but the chill remained. "We will provide you with the resources you need to survive. We will even share our music and our art. But you will never again touch the stars until you can prove that you've learned the lesson we spent 5 centuries mastering. Power is not the ability to destroy. It is the wisdom to refrain." As the golden mesh tightened around the Xylanth system, the human fleet, the Mist, the Titans, and the Overseer began to fade into subspace. They weren't leaving because they were finished. They were leaving because they had other sectors to stabilize. The last thing Varkas saw before the sky turned into a permanent, shimmering gold was a message scrolling across his HUD. It wasn't a threat. It was a status update from the Sol-Zero system. The world grew quiet. The Xylanthia sun shone through the golden grid, casting long, geometric shadows across the city. They were safe. They were fed. They were protected. And they were absolutely, terrifyingly alone. High-Warlord Varkas looked at his hands, that had ordered the deaths of millions, and realized the ultimate irony. Humanity hadn't destroyed them. They had done something far worse. They had made the Xylanth irrelevant. 10 standard years had passed since the Great Recalibration. In the grand tapestry of cosmic time, it was a mere heartbeat, but for the inhabitants of the known galaxy, it felt like an eternity of enforced evolution. The once violent borders of the Xylanth Hegemony were now shimmering walls of golden silence. High-Warlord Varkas, once a man of fire and iron, sat on a bench in the center of Xylanthia's reclaimed gardens. He was no longer a prisoner of war. He was a student of peace. He looked up at the sky where the phase anchors pulsed with a rhythmic, soothing light. The annoyance protocol had ended, replaced by something the humans called the sovereign audit. Every ship, every station, and every planetary governor now operated under a set of mathematical constraints that made warfare not just illegal, but physically impossible. "You're looking at the anchors again, Varkas," a familiar voice said. Varkas didn't turn. He knew that calm, resonant tone. Overseer Malachi Reed stood beside him, appearing not as a digital god, but as the man he had first met in the orchard. He was wearing the same worn work clothes, looking like he had just finished pruning a row of hybrid roses. "I am trying to understand the geometry of our cage," Varkas replied, his voice devoid of its old gravelly rage. "You didn't destroy us. You just made us perfect." "Why?" Reed sat down on the bench, looking out over the city that was now a marvel of efficiency and green spaces. "We didn't want to be your masters, Varkas. We wanted to be your mirror. For 500 years, we looked at our own history, our wars, our genocides, our greed, and we were disgusted. We realized that if we ever left the Sol-Zero system, we would either destroy the galaxy or be destroyed by it. So you became the architects of a new cage for everyone," Varkas noted. "No," Reed corrected him softly. "We became the architects of the silence. We realized that the only way to save the galaxy from the human virus was to cure the galaxy of the need for conflict. We didn't just give you our technology, we gave you our restraint. On the horizon, a massive human titan descended from the clouds. It didn't drop bombs or deploy troops. It released a swarm of terraforming nanites that began to heal the scars of the old industrial zones, turning ruins into forests in a matter of hours. This was the final stage of the audit, the total restoration of the natural order. The Galactic Council has dissolved itself, Reed continued. There is no more politics, no more Big Five empires, just a collection of species learning how to exist without trying to eat their neighbors. We've reached the final calculation. Varkas looked at the Overseer. And what happens to the humans now? You have won. You are the apex. Will you sit on your thrones forever? Reed smiled, and for the first time it was a smile of genuine relief. That's the part you won't believe, Varkas. We're leaving. Varkas's mandibles clicked in shock. Leaving? To where? Beyond the reach of this galaxy, Reed said, standing up. We've finished the experiment. We've proven that we could stabilize a chaotic universe without burning it to the ground. Now, we're going to find a place where we don't have to be overseers anymore. We're going to find a place where we can just be gardeners. Suddenly, the golden grid in the sky began to fade from a brilliant yellow to a soft, ambient silver. It wasn't disappearing. It was becoming part of the background radiation of the universe. A permanent, self-sustaining system of peace that no longer required a human hand to guide it. The Titan in the distance dissolved into a cloud of starlight, its purpose fulfilled. Around the galaxy, every human ship and every human station began to blink out of existence, jumping into the deep, dark void between galaxies. The Lattice will remain. Reed's voice now sounded distant, as if he were already light years away. It will protect you. It will guide you. But the keys are now in your hands. Don't make us come back, Varkas. We really like our new garden. Varkas watched as the last shimmering trace of Malachi Reed evaporated into the evening air. The High-Warlord looked up at the stars, now free of war fleets, free of conquerors, and filled with a terrifying, beautiful potential. For 500 years they had feared the monsters of Sol. But as Varkas breathed in the sweet, clean air of a world that had been saved from itself, he realized the humans hadn't been monsters at all. They were the only adults in a room full of children, and they had finally taught the children how to play without drawing blood.